Welcome to The Spotlight, the podcast where veterans and military spouses connect and share how their military experience has transformed their lives and their businesses. Here's your host, Bob Louthan.
Hey, this is your host, Bob Louthan, founder of the VeteranCrowd Network, the network that brings veterans and veteran-led businesses together with each other and the resources they need to prosper. And you are tuning into The Spotlight. Well, about 6 years ago, I got really frustrated with politics, and I wrote a piece I called Vision 2020 at the time. The concept that I had was that Congress needed more veterans. And so at one point in this past century, Congress was comprised of about 70% veterans, and it had fallen off to about 18%. And I wanted to see more veterans running for Congress because I just kind of had enough and was fed up. But that trend is happening. We're seeing some folks running for Congress. We're seeing more young veterans stepping up, particularly post 9/11 veterans. But this past fall, a friend of mine wrote an op-ed piece about something else that really resonated with me. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. I welcome my friend Todd Connor. He's a U.S. Navy veteran. He was the founder of Bunker Labs. He's the author of a book called The Third Shift Entrepreneur. And he is also now a candidate for the state Senate in the 4th District in Indiana. Todd, a second time on the program. Welcome back. Nice to have you.
Thanks, Bob. I love being with you, and I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Todd, you wrote an op-ed piece back in the fall, like I said, that just resonated with me, and it made a lot of sense. And so today I want to talk about that, and basically start out by saying, we had seeing all the symptoms. We've got this bipartisan vitriol. We've got, really, split on the issues, a lot of ugliness in politics. All of these things, we're seeing all these symptoms, but you were the first person that had written something where I kind of saw somebody kind of define the problem. Can you just let's just start there. We're seeing all these symptoms, but help everybody define the problem.
Yeah. The problem in this country is, I'll say some things that I think we have consensus on, and then I'll move us into things that we haven't yet thought about. And so I think the problem in this country is this polarization. And a polarization requires two polarities, right? And so simply said, it's, the Republican, the Democratic Party, sort of the polarity. This is neither cyclical nor normal. Where we are at today as a country does not have sort of historical precedent until and unless you go back to sort of Civil War days. Mm-hmm. And I think I say that to not sound alarmist, but to not have us lulled into thinking that somehow the system will self-correct. Let's do a quick look back. So the problem that we're trying to solve for is the polarity. You could talk about this as a two-party system, but it's a mental paradigm that says it's either this or that. There's two choices. And what's problematic when there's two choices for anything is that the quickest persuasion path is not to sort of make arguments for what you believe and what you can offer. It's actually to make disparaging arguments about the other side. That's actually just the cheaper path.
We're in attack politics, right?
So this is not actually, I come at this more with sort of the lens of decision science and how do reasonable people otherwise end up in sort of unreasonable decision systems? And so I want us to I'm going to ask us to sort of suspend our current understanding of political actors. Forget names for a second. Let's just talk about systems and incentives. And so the problem that we're in is that we have this sort of polarity of a political system. Michael Porter and Catherine Gale, Michael Porter, who's the kind of godfather of organizational competitive strategy out of Harvard Business School, Porter's Five Forces, Catherine Gale, who's a political reformer out of Wisconsin, teaches at Kellogg. They looked at the political industry and said, if you look at the political industry as just any industry, it's operating as an illegal duopoly. If it was a regulated industry, we would have intervened, called it a duopoly, and have broken it up to facilitate competition. The reason monopolies and duopolies are illegal in this country is because it aggregates power and wealth in spite of customers. in spite of the people that you're trying to serve. That's why we don't allow monopolies in this country, or we regulate them as such, because it hurts consumers.
We got Congress with an approval rating of well below 20%, and yet we send 90% of the people back over and over again. As entrepreneurs, we would be destroyed by the market. Right?
And this is what's so important is like I've done a lot of work in politics, as have you, but I come at this thinking like an entrepreneur, which is you've got a marketplace that's arguably an illegal duopoly if you frame it in conventional ways about supplier power, new entrant power, things that facilitate a healthy marketplace. And then I think as an entrepreneur, man, there's a marketplace with two options, with a 13% satisfaction rate. That's a market to disrupt. I mean, if this was mattresses, I would have started a mattress company.
Right.
If you said there's a marketplace where people are wildly dissatisfied, interestingly, Republicans are dissatisfied with the Republican Party, Democrats are dissatisfied with the Democratic Party. So it's not even as though, and then they're dissatisfied with the two options writ large, even as they sort of are forced to go to the polls and choose between those things. And so that's just the data. I mean, this is just what is true. The other thing that is true is people are walking away from both parties. Colorado, I think, is the first state in the country to have majority independents, where there are more independents than Republicans and Democrats combined. And similar trends are playing out in other places. Military veterans are 50% registered independents, right? And so they are struggling with this system. I'll say one other thing. In an environment in which you have gerrymandered districts, which Republicans and Democrats do to aggregate power, and it's a bad practice, and both parties do it. Some worse than others, some places worse than others, but both parties in varying ways engage in it. When you have gerrymandered districts, which create safe seats, and then you have closed primaries, which are very low turnout, and really who's engaged in those things are people that have a vested financial or political interest, or are deeply ideological and therefore kind of super consumers of democracy systems. You end up with more ideological candidates, and that's really where the action is. So 83% of members of Congress are decided by roughly 10% of voters, and that is like the most alarming statistic. So this is all bad. By the way, let me back up and say, look, I'm a registered Democrat. I vote in Democratic primaries. I'm running for office as a Democrat. So this isn't meant to be an affront to anyone's political identity, but it is a system critique to say this system isn't working, and it is not sustainable. It's unhealthy, and it doesn't facilitate what it needs to facilitate, which is representation of voters. By the way, not just the voters that vote in primaries, but everybody. So
we got these symptoms out there, all this dissatisfaction, all this frustration. The numbers bear out, like you just said. Congress got a 13% approval rating, but send 90% of them back every time, right? It's symptoms. You need to be kind of like the doctor, right? But what's the root cause? What is the root cause that you think is driving all of this?
Yeah, because that's really where the conversation has to move. So we can all agree it's dysfunctional, but there is a Republican story as to what the root cause is. And you saw this in President Trump's campaign. It's, kind of drain the swamp, right? And then you have Democratic answers, which tend to center around money in politics, or Citizens United, or voting access, right? And by the way, I have opinions on all that. I don't think those are root cause issues. Here's the root cause issue. The root cause to me is, how do you shift incentives? And it's really the closed partisan primary that is the primary problem in this country. It is that. If you change the way you do primary elections, and you open up primaries, and I'll talk about specifically the solution here. If you offer up open primaries, so instead of having to vote in a Republican or Democratic primary, which you have to usually do some pre-work to do, you offer one primary, everyone gets to run, you have partisan association, you might have 4 Democrats running, 5 Republicans running, maybe a Hoosier state majority, maybe someone who represents, tax freedom party, Green Party. So you have a smorgasbord of candidates running in one open primary. You go in that primary, you vote for your favorite candidate, you go to the general election, and where you have the top 5 candidates, top 5 vote getters presented, and you rank order your preferences for those candidates. You say, this is my first choice, my second choice, my third choice, my fourth choice. So ranked choice voting and open primaries is the combination solution that we call final five voting. So my hope is on this podcast, Bob, is that just like everyone today understands the filibuster and has an opinion on it, I would love final five voting to make it into the popular vernacular. And people start saying, why don't we have final five voting in our state?
We've seen examples of this. We've seen examples of this in Virginia. The Republican Party used a form of this, and it resulted in a slate that the Republicans flipped Virginia in the recent election. And I think what it did, Todd, was it tempered the candidates. We got candidates that had a broader appeal because they had to appeal to a broader base, because they couldn't just win by that plurality, 33% plus one, so to speak. And so they did have to appeal to a broader base of Virginians, and that was effective. But don't both parties resist this? I mean, this is a threat to the central power metrics that the parties have, right?
It's interesting. There's momentum for these electoral innovations on both sides of the aisle. And that's what's interesting. Alaska recently passed a version of final five voting. Maine recently passed a version of final five voting. California has a version of this. Now it's a top two. They call it the jungle primary. I think what we want is top four, top five. So I think it's not quite where it needs to be, but it's a version of this. New York City did their elections. So you've got some Virginia Republican Party. There are 5 southern states that do their military ballots using ranked choice voting. In a state like Illinois that's very blue, you've got a lot of Democrats who are pushing on ranked choice voting. In a state like Indiana that's very red, you've got more moderate Republicans who are saying, look, we should have a better system. We don't want our Republicans getting hijacked in sort of ideological primary fights. And so I think there's an emerging consensus on this. Do I expect the parties to lead on this? Not necessarily, because incumbents have gotten to where they are through the system as it's currently designed. But I think what it does is it appeals to it appeals to sort of the majority populations that you're trying to represent. So if you're a person who says, I'm running to sort of represent a district, but I know that I sort of don't ideologically represent that whole district, then then you have something to lose in this. But if you're trying to be solutions oriented, it's a great system. And I think that there are a lot of elected officials. I've had conversations in Wisconsin, Indiana, other places with elected officials, Republicans and Democrats, who came with good intent. They wanted to do a job, and they are beyond frustrated at the inability to do that. And so I think you're going to see consensus emerge. And if you get 4 or 5 or 6 states implementing these reforms, pretty soon you see a tidal wave. And I think all 50 states will soon follow.
We're going to talk about Veterans for Political Innovation, but would you explain to the listening voter what happens when they go into an election and it's ranked choice? What do I do? How do I pull the levers? How does that work?
So today, what you would do is you go to an election, you see one Republican name, one Democratic name. You live in a district where it's either majority Democrat or majority Republican. So your vote sort of doesn't really matter at that point for most things. And I talk about that because voters are smart. They will vote if there is an incentive to vote. The reason they don't vote is because too often there's no incentive. So in a ranked choice voting system, open primary system, what you would do is instead of 2 choices, 1R, 1D, and you know who's going to win already, you go and you might see, let's say it's a Democratic district. You might see 3 Democratic names, 2 Republican names, and you might, and then you order your preferences. You say, you know what, this Democrat's my first choice. She's sort of, pro-union. My second choice is this other Democrat who's kind of, big on environmental issues. My third choice is actually that moderate Republican who talks a lot about economic development and keeping taxes low. And then my fourth choice is that other third Democrat who's sort of the Justice Democrat, who, is a little bit, that's my fourth choice. And by the way, my fifth choice, I'm not going to vote for that one Republican who seems really outrageous. They're not going to get any of my 5 votes or any of my votes.
So then the votes get counted and you don't have a winner, but there's this instant runoff kind of an element to it.
Exactly. Yeah. So then the votes get instant. It's an instant runoff, right? So if my first choice winner doesn't win, my vote gets reallocated to my second choice. If that person doesn't win, my vote gets reallocated to my third choice, and so on until a winner is declared with more than 50% of the vote. And what's so interesting about this is immediately, that system of voting immediately shifts the incentive structure for candidates, donors, as well as, if you win as a candidate, how you govern. And you're seeing this with elected officials in Alaska and Maine who operate with more independence, because they're not worried about sort of getting knocked off in a primary fight, which is a very narrow lane. They know that they're doing things in the vested interest of the population writ large. So yeah, that's how the votes get tabulated. And really it creates an incentive structure where as you campaign, and you saw this in New York City with their mayoral election, negative campaigning was dialed down, 30% increase in voter participation, so over a 90% satisfaction rate amongst New York voters saying this is a better way to vote. And then you got, an African-American mayor, which we haven't had in a long time, but also someone who's kind of pro-police, right? So you got this alchemy that probably would not have emerged out of a closed Democratic primary, of a unique candidate who, at the end of the day, the argument is really better represents what New York City wants right now. And so as a candidate, you start making appeals to be people's second, third choice. So if you're a candidate who gets up and is a bomb thrower, tears everyone down, you don't win any of those second choice votes. And you can't really get past your 20% of committed, primary or ideological kind of committed folks if you can't build a broader appeal. And what we want is candidates building a broader appeal, being solutions oriented, having to be for something instead of against something. And that's, that to me is really the crux of what we're trying to do.
I think everybody can identify with that sort of that evening ad blast on the evening news. And I tell you what, I didn't know what any of the candidates were for, but I sure found out how the world was going to end if the other guy got elected.
That's right.
So
right.
After our break, we're going to come back. We'll be talking to Todd Connor and we're going to be talking a little bit about Veterans for Political Innovation.
Honor, duty, service. At the Veteran Crowd Network, we're focused on our next mission, bringing veterans, veteran-operated businesses, and veteran service organizations together with each other and the resources they need to prosper. That's why we are launching the Veteran Crowd Rewards Program, exclusively for our individual and corporate members. Now you can save on travel, restaurants, goods, and services from brands you trust online and at over 900,000 locations nationwide. Find out more today at VeteranCrowdNetwork.com. If you are a veteran-operated business, or a VSO, consider the connections, the network, the benefits, the engagement, and success of working with other veterans again. The Veteran Crowd Network, you paid a lot of dues to join this club.
My guest is Todd Connor. Welcome back to the Spotlight on the Veteran Crowd Network. Todd, let's talk a little bit about VPI, Veterans for Political Innovation. Tell everybody what's going on there.
Yeah, so I've already told you I'm passionate about changing the election systems in this country. Final five voting is the preferred solution. There's national effort afoot from various state-based organizations, fair vote organizations, democracy reform organizations to kind of push on these issues. But they're a little bit technical. They're a little bit wonky. It's not quite in the public vernacular. And as we were engaging in this work, which is really for me has been a passion project, I linked up with Eric Bronner out of Missouri, and he had been doing some work on this, and some others around the country, Dan Biga, other thought leaders. And we said, you know what, there's a unique role for veterans to play. If we can organize veterans, they can be unique messengers for the importance of, we don't even call it reform, we call it innovation, election innovation. Why veterans? Because veterans are 50% registered independents and are therefore excluded from closed primary systems. I mean, just think about that. Think about the moral wrong.
Do you know how many veterans are actually registered voters and how active we are? Do we have that statistic? We don't?
That's a great question. I'm sure it exists. I don't have it at the ready. Okay. I should, though. It's a good question. Because here's what we do know. Veterans are more civically engaged. They're more publicly engaged. They're 30% more likely to run for office. I'm going to presume that they're more likely to vote. It's only logical that they would.
Right.
But they are structurally excluded from closed primary systems if you are a registered independent. That just doesn't sit right with me. So
I think in the state of Virginia, like an independent can vote in the Democratic or the Republican primary, but not both, right?
Not both. And you call that semi-open primaries. So some states are different in that, where you can sort of show up and pick a primary ballot to vote in, so other states don't. So there's iterations of open primaries. We believe in open primaries, that you ought to be able to go vote in a taxpayer-funded primary election. Any election is taxpayer-funded. You ought to be able to vote. And so veterans are unique messengers for this. The faith in all their institutions, as you know, is just plummeting in this country. People no longer sort of trust doctors, judges, elected officials, but they trust veterans because there's bona fides about having, worn the uniform and served the country. So we're organizing this effort. We've got veterans active in, I think, 26 different states, who just have said, look, I'm frustrated with the current system.
You're a good recruiter, man. You got me,
We got you, Bob.
That's right.
And really I'm doing something which seems radical, which is I'm not making it. I mean, I feel emotional about these issues, but we're making an intellectual appeal to say, look, we're all tired of being outraged. We're exhausted from being outraged. Right. So how do you actually fix this? How do you actually not? And by the way, most political candidates tell you the answer is just elect me and don't elect that guy.
Right.
Well, we've done that. That playbook doesn't work. What's the What's the solve on this? And so veterans are eager for solutions. They don't just want to be put in the outrage machine and spit out the other side. We've done that. It doesn't work. And so, so there's a lot of enthusiasm about people who are like, actually talk smart to me. Actually explain to me the incentive structure of why an open primary, 5 candidates, ranked choice voting, instant runoff. Explain why that works. And people get really intellectually convicted and say, yeah, this can work. And there's movement in a lot of states for these reforms to be implemented. So we're bringing veterans to the fight.
I think about primary examples are Joe Manchin and Senator Murkowski, right? Who one kind of takes some stands against the Republican Party, and the other takes some stands against the Democratic Party, and the threat, the tool is that we're going to primary you out of your position, right? Because you're not adhering to the party's objective, right? Well, there's nobody who's more clearly looking after his home state than the Joe Manchin right now, right? Yeah. Who does he answer to, right? And this is just so glaringly obvious that, we need to fix this, because here's this tool, this hammer that, they typically use to bring that person in line, even if it's not in the best interest of their constituents.
And it's really even, because they've become such flashpoints in today's politics. But if you just look at the data set, there are no, just substantive policy making in any bipartisan fashion has become toxic in and of itself. I mean, the minority party won't do it because it gives wins to the majority party. So you have to sort of suspend our understanding of current events and look at the data and say, forget the current actors and where we sit with that, but look at what's happening, and it's not functioning. It's just not functional. And up and through the mid 90s, we had essentially a soft 4-party system in this country, and that's what folks sort of forget. We had a substantial, almost 30% of the Democratic Party was more conservative on some things than members of the Republican Party.
You get crucified for reaching across the aisle, basically.
You just can't. It's a third rail. You just can't. And so how do you change the incentives where you say, rather than the incentive structure saying don't ever reach across, the incentive structure actually says you actually have to reach across. You better come back with having gotten things done, because that's actually what voters want. Voters want our Congress to be functional. And so the mental trap for all of us is, in theory, it's like we all hate Congress, but we love our congressperson. We have to change incentives, and that's going to make some folks uncomfortable, because sometimes it feels good to have someone screaming back at you exactly the things that you believe. But if we're all doing that, then nothing gets done. And so it's just time for this conversation. We just need to have this conversation about what is it that we actually want from our elected officials.
Social media is a great tool, Todd, but is the echo chamber effect of social media exacerbating some of this problem, do you think?
There's so many contributing factors. I think about social media I think about the degradation of community-based belonging. I mean, people are really confused about what does it mean to be part of a community. And sometimes we think hating on the same things is the same as loving the same things. It is not. COVID and people being isolated has been a problem. Money in politics is a problem. There's a lot of things that are contributing. I look at all that and say, I can't fix social media and confirmation bias, which is sort of what it is. We just get refed the same stories. I do think these election innovations, I never want to overpromise like it's a golden egg. But I do think it is at the crux of, if you do it, it really changes incentives pretty immediately. People's behavior changes.
They've got to appeal to me as a Republican. They can't sell me on all of the Democratic issues. They've got to find compromise. And I think it's exactly what this does. I mean, it makes my vote count, even when I'm a Republican voting in a primary where there's a Democrat at stake. I mean, it's just,
that's right.
There's so much wisdom in what you're doing here. How do people get in touch with Veterans for Political Innovation and get involved?
Yeah. Google Veterans for Political Innovation and you'll get our website. It's veteransforpoliticalinnovation.org or v-pi.org. Reach out to me. My info's there. Join us. We have a volunteer intake process. I'd love to have veterans in all 50 states saying we're not satisfied with the way our political system is working. And none of us should be. And there are specific reforms that we can implement that would change that. And then really the action is going to be at the state level. That's the other thing, is people like to focus on what the United States Senate's doing. The action is at states. States determine how they conduct their own elections. Citizens can do this through a ballot initiative. That's how they've done it in places like Alaska. The citizens said, forget the power structure. We're going to take matters into our own hands. Nevada's going to have a ballot initiative as well. So citizens are stepping up saying, look, this is not working. And we're not going to get that from, political leaders that have been there a long time. It's just not, this isn't the issue set that they're going to sort of push on. So citizens need to take power into their own hands. And there's a way to do that. And there's ballot initiatives, there's legislative action. Go get involved, sign up, represent your state, go talk to elected officials. A lot of where we're having success is veterans talking to other veterans who are in elected office and saying, look, Vietnam vet, this isn't what you fought for. I mean, this doesn't work. Here's a solution set. And what's interesting is a lot of folks just haven't thought about the nature of the primary elections themselves. They haven't actually really stopped to consider, does this system of elections get us the outcomes that we want?
I did the math. If 10% of the people vote in the primaries and you limit it to, it's closed, so it's half of the 10%, so 5% vote, and then you get one issue. A person with a lot of money and a motivated base can become the representative in a district that's going to go one way or the other with a very small percentage. 1 or 2% of the active voters can actually determine who's going to Congress. It's a real problem, and we've got to fix it.
We have to fix it. And then once you're there, the incumbency scaffolding kind of grows up around you, and it becomes very hard to take those folks on.
They whip you into shape. They don't call the in Congress, they don't call them a whip for no reason, right?
Right.
All right. You got to corral all those folks and get them to vote the way they want them to vote. Hey, I'm going to have Eric Bronner on. Mike Cantwell is the leader in the state of Virginia. I'm going to try to have him on. So we're going to have an episode talking with Eric. We're going to have an episode talking with Mike about issues that may be more specific in my home state. We're, the legislature's in session here in Virginia right now, and we've been kind of reaching out to folks. There are a couple of bills in Virginia to drive some of these initiatives. Running into some uphill challenges, as we speak. But, I just am really pleased, Todd, to be a part of this bipartisan effort that really has a logical approach to fixing some of these problems that, we haven't seen before. I'm really encouraged.
Well, Bob, I want to say this too. I want to thank you for being involved. And I'll say this too about, America, we have a way of moving through these moments, but there's cyclicality to, we get stuck and then we find a way to move beyond being stuck. And always in American history, and I hope this rings true in this moment, reformers kind of come to the foreground and often from outside the political system to say, look, this isn't working. We got to move the country forward. I remind people that George Washington was the first and last unaffiliated president we've ever had, did not belong to a political party. Abraham Lincoln at the time was a third party candidate. I mean, running from what was then sort of a minority outside party, what is now the Republican Party. But so this is also consistent with American history. I just want to affirm to folks that if you're wanting to have this conversation, it's not disloyal to the party that you belong to. It is in the spirit of patriotism, and we got to get adults in the room who are like, this outrage cycle isn't working. What is the solution? So I think it's a good time for folks that really want to move the country forward to step forward and lead. And who better to do that than veterans?
I'm humbled that you put me among the adults in the room category, Todd. There's some people that would question your judgment in that regard. We're out of time, Todd. We're going to put links to Veterans for Political Innovation and a lot of other things on our show notes for this episode. And Todd, again, thank you for what you're doing. You've done Bunker Labs, you're an author, you're doing this, and you're running, you're stepping up, and you got your hand in the game. And I just want to give you a big shout out, give you the Army Bravo Zulu for that. Thanks for being a guest on the program.
Thank you, Bob.
You've been listening to the Spotlight on the VeteranCrowd Network. Our guest has been Todd Connor, and we've been talking about Veterans for Political Innovation. I'll throw out again another Bravo Zulu to Todd, and that's a wrap.
Thank you for listening to Spotlight by VeteranCrowd. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. For more information and uploads, please visit our website at VeteranCrowdNetwork.com. We'll see you next time.